Yeah, I'm Robin Steinke, president of Luther Seminary, and it is my delight to welcome you to this Bonhoeffer Salon. I want to introduce to you the dean of our faculty and professor of Old Testament, Professor Rolf Jacobson, who's going to narrate a bit and introduce our distinguished speakers this evening. So we're really glad you're here, both in person and online in this hybrid event. So thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure to welcome you today to the 2024 George Oss Memorial Lecture. George Oss was a diminutive man with a gigantic passion for evangelizing. He was professor here for many years at Luther Seminary, and his legacy still lives on in the many students that he fired up with his love of Christ. One of them remembered fondly how he had been charged by Professor Oss to remember that every Sunday was a day of ultimate significance. Had you preached a sermon that confronted every person in the congregation with the necessity of Jesus, he asked, it might be the last opportunity you would have. Remember that, Tripp and Andy. He sent out students burning with the desire to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ to bear wherever they found themselves. The theme tonight for the Oss Lecture is Bonhoeffer, the Gospel, and the other, a Bonhoeffer Salon. And our speakers tonight include a relatively new person to this community who's just beginning to publish and establish an academic footprint. And we also have Tripp Fuller. Tripp Fuller is the host of the Homebrewed Christianity podcast Nation, and he is a philosophic theologian and a visiting professor at Luther Seminary. He lives in North Carolina with his wife and what he calls 3 humanoids, one of whom, his son Elgin, is here. Tripp writes, it was in the church that I was challenged to grow in compassion, seek after justice, invest in people, knowing the potential power of a community centered in the way of Jesus. Our other salon leader tonight is Dr. Andrew Root, professor and Carrie Olson Balson Chair of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary. Andy is an award-winning author who has written over 25 books, which range in topic from divorce to dogs, secular to sacred, and the Bible to Bonhoeffer. Andy also suffers as a fan of Minnesota sports, but he does triumph as a supporter of the greatest football club on earth, Manchester City. We're pleased to welcome Doctors Fuller and Root today to continue the engagement of the gospel with our culture. Please welcome Tripp and Andy.
So thank you all for being here that are in person and all of you joining online or watching it later. When we started talking about the Oss Lecture, and it was right after I'd come to teach my first class here at Luther, and the intensives are quite a time, both if you're a student, back-to-back intensives with 1-day break, and that's when they have a lecture, and you're like, that's what you want me to do with my free time? And then after this lecture, you end up online where these people you had a few intense days with, you're now supposed to process these texts and your stories and such, and I'm like, well, what do we do with that day between where the students that are here and active students of at Luther are here and the community that's connected to the school get together? If Bonhoeffer was talking about the gospel, and so it's snowing a lot last January, and I go over to good old Andy Root, and I say, you like Bonhoeffer, Andy? You know he started a seminary, and you know he spent a lot of time hanging out, doing music and having conversations. And as Luther Theological Seminary's resident extrovert, don't you think we should move beyond a lecture format and come up with a collaborative form of discourse, perhaps a salon under the guise of Bonhoeffer? And you felt the lure.
I did. I was frightened, completely frightened about the extroverted thing. But here I am.
Well, and here's really our goal, is what Bonhoeffer discovered in his life is that the gospel he encountered and where he found faith was a place to begin, but not a place to end. And it continued to grow, and it continued to grow in relationships as he encountered the other. And the other can take all sorts of different forms and shapes and experiences. And so what our goal is in the format of a salon, where the people that are bringing content are really bringing stories, narratives, and ideas to provoke conversations at a table. Our goal is to tell vignettes in Bonhoeffer's story to set you up to share some of your own vignettes of encounters that have transformed, and in a sense where the other's face on behalf of the image of God that it bears requires you to expand your vision of the gospel. And so we're going to pause at 3 different moments in Bonhoeffer's life, and we'll go back and forth between one of us set it up. We talk a bit, y'all talk a bit. And for those of you online, when they're talking, one of us is going to come talk to you online. But then at the end, there's going to be a chunk of time where you'll get the opportunity at your tables to weave together Bonhoeffer's story that we're sharing and the parallel stories in your life. And hopefully, if we do a mediocre job or better, then like Bonhoeffer's students who ended up figuring out what is it like to be faithful to a gospel in a time of intense challenges as Nazi Germany came to reign and all those challenges, that you won't just have a vision of the gospel that's compelling in the face of idolatry, but you'll have faces and stories of friends who share it with you. And that is why Bonhoeffer mixing with the salon, that's how we got here, or that's the origin story of sorts.
Yeah. And so what I want to do is just for 2 minutes, set the ground of who Dietrich Bonhoeffer is, just very quickly. As you know, there are 1,000-page biographies of Bonhoeffer. So I'm going to try to do this in two quick minutes. And really what I want you to know, and what Tripp and I both want you to experience as you come into this, is that to just try as hard as you can right now to remember you don't know Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I think we all come here because we have some connection to him, maybe, or we just wanted free food. Both are legit reasons to be here. But you probably come here and you are a Bonhoeffer fan. He's been influential as you've read him. He's in some kind of inspiration to you. But I do want to remind you, we're talking about Bonhoeffer and the other, that Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself is other. Mm-hmm. That he is a German. Most of us, not all of us, but most of us in this room are not Germans. And he is an early 20th century person. And he never lived through rock and roll. He didn't go through a 1960s revolution. He never really knew a consumer society. So this is an early 20th century person. But nevertheless, he inspires us, and he inspires us because it's debatable, of course. But he did give the ultimate sacrifice, and he dies in 1945 in a concentration camp in Flossenburg. It's a very complicated story, a story scholars are still debating. Was he a martyr? Was he not? Was he a political casualty, or was this a martyr for his faith? And in many ways, Dietrich Bonhoeffer doesn't care. He's seeking to be faithful to the people in his life and to hear the call of Jesus Christ and follow it. So we're talking about a man born in 1906 who dies in 1945. We're talking about a man who is inspired most because he is someone who puts together his lived experience, a rich narrative of his life with theology. So this is someone who's a pastor thinking deep theological thoughts, a theologian who always has pastoral concerns on his mind. So as we enter into this, there's so many nuances to his story, but we want you to come to Dietrich Bonhoeffer a little fresh tonight, hear these stories, but also see what they do for you, as Tripp said, how they lead you into conversation and lead you into community.
Mm-hmm. All right. So for those of you that have this fun little discussion guide, and those of you online, if you printed it out or looking at the PDF, I'm dyslexic, so I don't like to read things, but writing something, Andy and I getting this down to enough words that will fit on one folded piece of paper was quite a feat. So you want to probably take this with you, but it also has quotes from Bonhoeffer in it that might provoke your conversation as you start at the end to integrate your story and his in these moments. And our first kind of encounter with the other is the other abroad. But before we get there, I just want you to notice this quote his friend and biographer tells about Bonhoeffer's faith. And for those of you that grew up enjoying the church and mainline Protestantism, there might be something similar to you in Bonhoeffer's story. I have a friend that's now a bishop at a mainline denomination, and she said, well, the true religion in my family was graduate school in the New York Times, but they let us go to church sometimes. And Bonhoeffer, when he had this awakening of faith, and his academic friends and family are like, really, what's this about, Dietrich? He's like, I want to be a theologian. And they're like, WTF, what a waste of a brilliant mind and all the connections you have, a very intellectual family. And his brother's giving him a hard time. And he just said, well, look, if you think the church is a bit bunk, I'm going to change it. And so you have somebody who is inheriting an upper middle class, overeducated, privileged space, and is getting a little picked on for a love of a church and an institution that seems dated, not contemporary. And it's there that he says, no, I'm not going to diminish it. I'm going to seize it, and I'm going to change it. And just imagine that energy as someone who goes abroad to find that version of the faith he was handed broken apart. And there are two different places when he goes abroad I want to lift up. The first, he ends up going with his brother to Rome. Now, if you are German and you're very Lutheran and you're very Protestant and you go to Rome and are moved by watching the pageantry of Holy Week, and we're talking seized in ways that his whole self-understanding of being Lutheran was not Catholic. Like, he took Luther seriously. He loved it. He's like, yeah, the Catholic Church they used to be run by a guy one step over from the Antichrist. And if he was constipated, he might actually think he's the Antichrist. Like, he had all of that Lutheran charge going in it. And in his stories back, he actually is waking up to going like, whoa, there's a whole different aesthetics, poetics, and rhythm going on here. And in its strangeness, it's not foreign to my encounter with the divine. It's a different invitation to meet the depths of a tradition I know, and yet it's not mine. And just the idea that you could encounter the other by going ecumenically abroad and realize that your vision of the church has to expand just to include the other people who share your baptism. They're in different countries, they're in different traditions, and that shaped Bonhoeffer, because when you notice throughout his time in the resistance, it's his ecumenical relationships is where they're getting enacted. It's that ecumenical vision that helps him think there can be a role for the church after the war. But where was the first place his ecumenical vision found purchase? It was being a stranger Holy Week in Rome. The other, he ends up, that I want to lift up is his time in New York. He goes because he was a nerd and gets done with graduate school very quickly, can't quite teach yet, so he's going to go spend a year abroad at Union Theological Seminary. Shows up, and he's like, look at these people. They aren't that smart. All these Americans, they're way too pragmatist, hung up on particular justice issues. They don't understand the intricacies of Luther. And he's getting really nerdy and judgy. And it takes a while for him to get past what he sees as the intellectual culture gap to the invitation that both the prophetic tradition within Union and eventually through his friend Frank Fisher encounter with the Black Church at Abyssinian Baptist Church, the prophetic tradition of the Black Church. And there, coming out of it later, he'll say that there was this move of theology from the phraseological to the real. He ends up spending time at Abyssinian Baptist Church, a Black Baptist church in Harlem. He gets to know the Harlem Renaissance Black spirituals, and he takes these songs, this tradition, a way in which a people encountering oppression learn to inherit a faith differently. And those are the stories he tells when he goes back and is sitting with his underground seminary and his students, and he's playing these hymns, and he's telling the stories of a church that risks proclaiming the gospel when the majority expression of it in their nation resists recognizing their personhood. And it was the friendships that he made in that space that helped him realize that the gospel is not something that is just to be articulated, but it's something that seizes you and turns you to the material reality where sin is being expressed. There in racism, you can see it in the South, and there's other travels. But when we think about how the other changes our picture of the gospel, it's in those relationships where it becomes incarnate once again, and that ends up seizing him, moving him further along.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Well said. Yeah, I have nothing to interact with on that other than I think that's a beautiful articulation that sets us up for our first conversation around our tables in this salon. So here's the question we want you to wrestle with together. It's a travel question. Tripp has just given us two beautiful vignettes of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the traveler, with a full passport, desiring to travel. Dietrich wanted to get all the way to India if he could. Unfortunately, he didn't get there, but traveling and his grandmother Julia paying for travel was a big part of his life. So we have a travel question for you. What experience have you had traveling? And we mean that both literally, but also metaphorically. Like, where have you traveled? Maybe to another country, maybe to another ecumenical community, maybe to another religious community at a time. Where have you traveled that's been transformational to you? Can you think of an experience where you've been invited or maybe even, kind of pushed to travel, and in the midst of that travel, you encountered otherness and it changed you?
Going. So Tripp is going to be with us during the table discussions this time, and then Andy will be with us. So here's what I want to do. I want to put the question back at Tripp. Have you traveled someplace that's been transformational?
Oh yeah. The two biggest examples were actually moving. I mean, I traveled plenty growing up, but those are road trips with family. But the first time we moved all the way across the country to Los Angeles from North Carolina, it was a completely wild and crazy experience where I was called to be a minister. I was good at being a youth minister, and I was not a Californian. And it took me 2 years to be mediocre at it there before I thought I knew what I was doing. And I had a very similar experience when we moved to Scotland. I worked at the University of Edinburgh for 3 years, but moving there and then going, I know how to exist in the academy, but I did not understand the European version, the UK system. I was so not Scottish. I didn't know. We moved into a Catholic neighborhood, and the fact that there were two ministers in my home, and they were both Protestants. Both of those experiences were places where my identity as a Baptist preacher's kid from the South who was a nerd and became there, they didn't fit, but you had just enough contact point. And thinking back to those times of those spaces, I feel like when I think about articulating the gospel, in my head, there are stories of friends that I have to include with how they can hear it.
Yeah.
Just like I feel like I was good at communicating it in North Carolina before we moved to California to teenagers. Then I get there and they didn't go to Vacation Bible School that taught them anything. So they didn't know any of the stories. And then I was so uncool. I had to get jeans that fit. And in Scotland, they're like, you
being so cool.
You came here on purpose for God,
Yeah.
And so,
all right. So we have our first question.
all right.
How did Bonhoeffer balance his peace ethic with the attempted assassination on Hitler? Do you have a clue?
Well, okay. So I'd say two things. One, that's a ongoing, like exactly how he processed it is debated. And it's also less debated at this point, but more contested because people tend to seize Bonhoeffer and project on him what they want him to be. But the two things I would kind of make note, and then there's a number of ways you can read it between this. One, Bonhoeffer never thought he didn't think he justified what he did. He always saw it that he was doing a sin, like that to participate in it. And you can see this in the third section. We'll talk a bit more about it. But it wasn't like, oh, I now think Jesus doesn't want me to turn the other cheek or something. It's the situation is such that this is kind of demanded of me. And the other thing I would say is in that processing, and there's a couple quotes of it in part 3 of this. The time he's writing this letter 10 years after the rise of Hitler, essentially, to his friends that are in the conspiracy and his brother-in-law. And he says, we don't have any ground to stand on. We don't have anything underneath our feet. He's inclusive of himself, of the guilt of the church. And that, regardless of exactly what you what kind of situation would ever use his legacy to do something unchristlike on behalf of God, you know? He never used history as a justification for identifying God with an act of injustice. And so he was always felt guilty about it. Or, you know, it would occasion guilt, it would be a sin.
Yeah. My sense is he always thought he would have that discussion with his maker. Like there was a come to Jesus moment, literally.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And for Bonhoeffer, I guess just thinking about the framing of tonight of the other, the encounter of God in the other. For him, when you see in his early theological work, in ecclesiology, it's the other ends up being the child. That's the crescendo, like what childlike faith, this vision of the child expanding it. He then, when he does his lectures on sin, fall, brokenness, in all of them, he's rereading these texts in a non-literal way, but taking the text seriously to say something about the brokenness and systemic problems and the way our own finitude and our own limitations gets amplified throughout the web of relations. And this material reality is the place where sin gets expressed. When it goes on to its Christology lectures, like Christ is encountered in this event, but that event is something that doesn't just happen once, it happens every time, right? And Andy, in the next segment, is going to talk about how the people he served occasioned it. And so that, like, standing before kind of reality, that standing before Christ isn't something he thinks just happens later. He actually thinks moment to moment, the Christian all of their experience in life is mediated by God. That last big quote in section 3 here is a good example where he says, "There's no part of the world, no matter how lost, no matter how godless, that has not been accepted by God in Christ and reconciled to God. Whoever perceives the body of Christ in faith can no longer speak of the world as if it were lost, as if it were separated from God. They can no longer separate themselves in clerical pride from the world." And so if for him, Christ the center, right, that is his big image in his Christology, means that there's no relation you have that's not mediated by Christ.
Yeah.
So that so there's not a single judgment day elsewhere. No, Christ has encountered neighbor, family, friend, enemy. And he even wrestles with how do you recognize it in the people who are supporting and legitimating the rise of Nazi Germany and Hitler. Like, even the people you're like, they're so stupid, dumb, and this is evil and wrong. And yet, while I was God's enemy, Christ died for me.
Yeah.
And so that,
So to that, couple of questions. Can you speak more to how Niebuhr influenced his theology?
Yeah. So Niebuhr was someone he deeply respected. In the most recent kind of the complete works of Bonhoeffer in English, they actually include letters back and forth between Niebuhr and Dietrich, and he's the one that organized to get him to come to Union. And I would say the big shift for him, for Niebuhr, that he saw in Niebuhr, was the inability for Niebuhr to set aside the social gospel tradition in America that he inherited. And yet he recognized in Niebuhr someone that took sin more seriously than he normally thought the social gospel movement did. But when he comes in to the classroom the first time, he finds the theology of so many of the students a bit shallow. They don't even understand they don't even understand Luther. They'll dismiss him. I make one quote and they'll move on. And Niebuhr kind of like has to let him know, like, we're coming out of a different space, but we're trying to get to a place where the Christian tradition in its fullness orients us as a people of God to the world as it is. And so, like, Niebuhr's what you might call Christian realism, it's something that ends up I mentioned earlier that move of the phraseological to the real. Charles Marsh, in one of the more recent biographies of Bonhoeffer, said that after that year at Union, and this is the last line in part 1 that I quoted, he said, "The American social theology, which had seemed so devoid of miracle, had remade him into a theologian of the concrete." It's when he gets on the boat, he gets his last letter from his brother, Bonhoeffer, to go back to Germany, that he gets the first word of just how popular the Nazi movement is getting.
Hmm.
And so when he gets back to Germany, and there's this growing responsiveness to the Nazi movement among the poor and working class in Germany, which you're about to hear Andy talk about going to serve as minister, it's there that he uses that line that we quoted, from the phraseological to the real. And so I think Niebuhr's role was a way of showing that you can be deeply formed by the inheritance of the Christian tradition, the Augustinian and Lutheran one that's there. And when you take the tradition and its notion of sin seriously, then you have to take the way your own institutions and your own relations can have just so stories that are cover-ups for institutional or collective or systemic sin. And it comes in his face, right, as he shows back up. It was Reinhold, by the way. Someone asked Reinhold or Richard. Reinhold was at Union. Richard was at Yale at that time, though they both, in different ways, are neo-Orthodox thinkers. And
so that ties to this next question. How do you think Bonhoeffer would process what's happening in the United States political scene today, especially given its impact on the rest of the world? Kind of putting those two in conversation.
Well, okay, so I mean, this is one of those fun questions, or ones that you just know it's going to be wrong, so it has to be fun, because how do you really know? But in Letters and Papers, so when he's from prison, and right before, when he's writing things like ethics, he's having a kind of come to Jesus moment with the institutions that came into modernity. The Lutheran Church, the nation state, the kind of emergence of technology of modernity and industrialism. He starts to see those things as having been false promises. Like, look what it ultimately results in: efficiency and death machines. Right. So he has a critique of the modern state that is it resonates with Jacques Ellul, who writes similar things after the war. And when he's asked, he uses this phrase of like religionless Christianity, and what happens if you get rid of God has required justification for morality, for order, and all these things, like what's left? And there he offhandedly kind of goes, well, maybe the church shouldn't own anything and no one should get paid. We have to learn to talk again, because if you say the word God, most people don't think it means anything we mean. And then we end up defending a thesis that's not been shaped by Jesus. So he has all these critiques of traditional language. And yet he goes, so what would the church do if it wanted to rebuild itself from the ashes? And he lifts up two things. One is the arcane disciplines. It's in English how we do it, but he means Lutheran sacraments. I mean the sacraments. But not, if you don't own a building and you're not paying anyone, what do the arcane disciplines look like? What if the institution that decided who could serve them and how they get served, it's already falsified itself with an allegiance of idolatry? So it's the disciplines when Jesus says, do these things. And the other is a Christological hermeneutic, but what he means is that you learn to see the world from the underside. And that is like the one takeaway towards the end of his life that he's reflecting on, that he's learned. And so when I think about America today and then what Dietrich could do, I think part of it is, are we as Christians more invested in the preservation of our institutions, they're thriving on the metrics and ideas that we had, or are we more invested in facilitating a tradition that forms you towards neighbor and enemy and non-human neighbors, where we're mediated by a broken body that nourishes us and it brings us to reconciliation? And then I also think he would say, if you want to know how you're doing, you should ask the same people I learned it from when I was in America, and that's those on the underside. And Frank Fisher takes him, who is a black student at Union with him. He joins a black church where he spends most of his time there. They take a trip through the South, and he sees how how kind of systemic racism and everything is going, and what how the church is organizing to resist it. And it was the criticisms of the moderate white clergy that you could think of, like King's letter from a Birmingham jail, that kind of criticism, when you became a trusted friend and heard how the black church talked about the white church, that kind of orients his vision of how to see the church related to culture. And I worry that part of what we've done in the American church is we want to reestablish, because we're still more culture dominant here than they were in Germany, that we'd rather figure out how to have our preachers and theologians play golf with president, than learn to see our nation and tell our story from the underside. Like, you could just imagine him going, you're organizing parents at church to go to a school board to edit the way you tell church the history of your nation, to eliminate how you treated Native people and make slavery seem not that big a deal. That is the opposite, right, of what happened in Germany after World War II. The German church went through a time of repentance, and the German nation learned over the course of a couple generations how to be straightforward about the shame. Even like putting markers in front of homes where Jews were forcibly removed and from their homes. So, like, these stories of the people we put under erasure are told. And I think that's something that in our present, can we tell our story as a nation from the perspective of the underside in the past and now? And when we do we trust that crosses give testimony to the presence of God? And anyway.
And I hear you starting with the church, not the other. Starting with our own introspection of ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, like that's one of the things that one of the ways Christians become obnoxious really quick is when the vision of God only makes demands on someone other than you.
Right. Yeah.
And I think by even like focusing right on these vignettes in his life of how the other made demands on him.
Yeah.
Through the face of the other, they're making demands on Bonhoeffer and his understanding of the gospel.
Yeah.
And then I hope for those on here now, if you ever get to use these kind of things and interact and the people having conversation, that you think of how the others in your life make demands and call a vision of the gospel out, to move it forward.
So again, this second vignette is Bonhoeffer at home. So Bonhoeffer abroad, now Bonhoeffer at home. And the first place that home is for Bonhoeffer is his family. If you want to know Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you have to know him inside of his family. His family is a very important Berlin family. His father, as Tripp said, is an academic. He is he really runs the research hospital in Berlin, and that's what brings the family to Berlin in the first place. Dietrich's mother, so his father is kind of new money, new standing, and his mother's family is an old family, old standing. They are clergy people. His grandfather and Dietrich's grandfather and great grandfather, Paula's father and grandfather, preached for the Kaiser at the Kaiser's court. So these are kind of old aristocrats. And so this is a connection of new prestige and old prestige in the Bonhoeffer family. But what's really important to know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer is that he comes from a large group of siblings. So with Dietrich included, there's 8 of them. And they really break down on the older ones and the younger ones. So the older ones, and Dietrich is one of the younger ones. So he has an older brother named Carl Friedrich, who will become a very important scientist, physicist, will be back and forth to Harvard. Harvard will try to get him to come teach there for a while. A very important person. His oldest sister is Ursula, and Ursula will marry a man named Rudiger Schleicher, who will be part of the resistance and will be killed in the last days, and will be very close to Dietrich. And he will actually, the Schleikers will live right next door to his parents when they downsize their house. And the only child who will live in that house is Dietrich. And Dietrich will go over to the Schleikers' house right before he's arrested. When the black limousine shows up in front of his parents' house, he sneaks out the back door, goes to his sister's house, has a meal, tries to call his brother-in-law to see what's going on before his father finally calls him and tells him he needs to come home, that these men have already rifled through his room and he needs to come talk to them. His next brother is Klaus, and Klaus will be an important figure. He's a lawyer, and he'll be important in the resistance as well. He'll be killed in the last days of the Third Reich as well. His next sister is Christina, and she marries a very important man, maybe the most important man for the resistance, a man by the name of Hans von Dahani, who, of course, is one of the kind of legal, up pretty high as a legal voice within the Abwehr, which is the Secret Service of this time. And the Abwehr, of course, which is supposed to be doing military intelligence for the Third Reich, eventually flips, and the coup d'etat happens through the Abwehr. So those are the older siblings. And they're all very close to Dietrich, but Dietrich is one of the younger ones. So the next siblings are the three younger ones. And I think it's very important for Bonhoeffer's theology to know that he's a twin, and to really know how, and the importance of relationality for Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the importance of what it means to be in community, is to know him through his family, but it's also to know the mystical connections with a twin. And his sister Sabine is very, very important to him. And I think one of the great prides of Dietrich's life is that it's Dietrich's connections in London that gets Sabine and her husband out of Germany. And they need to get out of Germany because Sabine's husband is a man by the name of Gertz Liepolz, who is, at least in Nazi law, is Jewish. I'm not sure if he's a practicing Jew, but he is loses his teaching position because of this. And eventually, in the late 1930s, things become very dangerous for them. And it's Dietrich's ecumenical connections in London that is able to get his sister out through Switzerland. But his sister's very, very important to him. There, at least one biographer says that at least one version of Life Together was written in Sabine's empty house. So when Sabine immigrates to England, Dietrich goes there with Eberhard Bethge, his good friend, and at least one version is written in that empty house. And they had to leave the house as if they would be back at noon. Butter still on the table, everything's still set up because they couldn't have any suspicions that they were gone. And in that kind of haunted house is where Dietrich writes at least one version of Life Together. And then he has a younger sister. His youngest sister is named Elizabeth. And these younger ones and older ones would kind of break down. And so when the older ones were having parties and courting and doing the things that you would do in Berlin in the early 20th century, the younger ones would be shooed off. And Dietrich kind of became the leader of the younger ones and would do very strange things with his siblings, like they would get together and contemplate their death, which is just really a man after my own heart in many ways. But I have, if you've been counting, I've missed one sibling in this rundown. I've said there's 8 of them, including Dietrich, and I've only given you 7. And the reason I've only given you 7 is because a major tragic story of the Bonhoeffer family is the second son, Walter. And Walter and Carl Friedrich are around the same age. And in 1918, so if you know your dates here, the Great War, World War I, is going on. And Carl Friedrich and Walter are of age now to go to the front, and they head off to the front. And the story goes that Paula Bonhoeffer saw them to the train station as they would go off to the front. And as they left on the train, she ran waving goodbye to them. Now, I think as Americans in the 21st century, we think that's just what good parents do. That is not what a woman from an aristocratic background does in a kind of, if you can think of this, a late Victorian age. But she very much loved these boys and loved her children and said goodbye to them with great emotion. Well, a letter comes home, and for the most part, for the Bonhoeffer family, it had been nothing but success after success. Bigger house after bigger house, promotion after promotion, children growing and doing well, going to gymnasium and advancing, and university on the horizon. And then a letter comes home in the midst of the Great War. And it's from Walter,
and he talks about troop movements and asks how his family's doing, and mentions towards the end of the letter that he's been wounded. A few days later, a letter comes to the house, and he's died of his wounds. And it's the first real rupture in the Bonhoeffer family. The story goes that essentially Karl Bonhoeffer went to his office and never came out. And he did, but emotionally never came out. He used to keep a family journal of the successes of the family, and particularly a long entry on Christmas Day. He didn't keep it for about a decade after Walter died. The grief was too heavy. When the news came and Paula heard it, she screamed with grief, screamed and screamed with heartbroken grief. Her grief was so heavy, she had to leave the family. She went to a neighbor's house, and a neighbor nursed her back. Dietrich was 12 years old when this happened. He was 12 years old when this great rupture happened. He'd already been a young person who had deep thoughts, but this really encased in him that you must always respect children. You must always respect the journey they're going through. In many ways, it brought Luther's theology of the cross home to him. So the theology of the cross never left Dietrich because of his experience as a 12-year-old boy. Now, there's a book written in the late 1990s that did a kind of family systems theory on the Bonhoeffer family, which seems very problematic in some ways. But one of the most interesting things that I kind of think is true, but we could never verify this historically, is that at some point, Paula and Karl, Dietrich's parents, made a deal. They probably didn't sit down at a cafe and sketch this out, but at some point they made a deal. And the deal was that Paula would find a way home. She would find a way back from her grief if Karl kept his hands off Dietrich. In other words, Walter was much more like his mother, was more artistic, much more into the maternal side, the religious side, and that she would come back for her grief. Again, I don't think they ever signed a contract on this, but there was some agreement that Karl would keep his hands off Dietrich and let Dietrich follow his more maternal side, follow his religious side, follow his musical side. And he did. And we know, as Tripp told us in the first vignette, that Karl never stood against Dietrich announcing he was going to be a theologian. He probably did send Karl Friedrich to tell him, don't waste your life on the church. It's backward. And then, of course, we see the arrogance of the young Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who did say he had to always pray about his own arrogance, that was his biggest issue he had to deal with. Every room he went in, he was sure he was the smartest person in it. So he had to pray about his own arrogance. And so when his brother, and you can see it, says, the church is backward, Dietrich. You're far too talented. Don't waste your life on it. He said, well, then I will reform it. And you can see that arrogance there. What we do know that I think does connect it with his family systems kind of thought, if you want to go there, or at least kind of gives us a sense of the pathos of this, is that Dietrich was given Walter's confirmation Bible. And this would be the primary Bible he would use for the rest of his life. So you can think of the experience abroad with the spirituals, carrying around these spirituals, putting them on, listening to the students and saying, who is Jesus Christ for us today, listening to this human pathos, and reading the scriptures with Walter's name still on the inside cover of this. That these really kind of set the texture of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life, of what it means to confess Jesus Christ in our suffering, what it means to live a human life in joy and in pain and seek for Jesus Christ in the midst of that. I think I have time for one more piece of Bonhoeffer at home. If there's another piece of Bonhoeffer at home, it's home for Dietrich Bonhoeffer is Berlin, and Berlin is home. I think a motif of his story is always back to Berlin. If you read his biography, there's a sense that he's always going away and back to Berlin, always back to Berlin. Berlin is Dietrich Bonhoeffer in many ways. When he returns from New York City in 1930, in that school year of 30 to 31, he comes home that summer and he's exhausted from his travels abroad. And his parents, he's the baby boy of the family, they try to shoo him off to his to their little retreat getaway, their little mountain house. They ask him to go get some rest, but he can't do it. He immediately goes and meets with Karl Barth and Bonn, and starts that relationship that will become very, very important during the resistance. It will be the first time he'll meet Karl Barth. Karl Barth will be very suspicious of this young man from Berlin who's here. If you know the backstory of Barth, he has started a whole theological revolution, really by opposing the theology that's happening in Berlin. So for a Berlin PhD to show up in his class, he is very, very uneasy about it. But Karl Barth was known to be skeptical of people, but also to be easily converted with one good statement or question. And in the first class, Dietrich raises his hand. He calls on him. He makes a statement and asks a question about Luther. And Karl Barth is enamored. He just loves him. And so they have dinner, and they really enjoy each other. And he becomes Dietrich's mentor, and particularly through the resistance is very important. Well, there's another situation going on here where Dietrich has had to put off, as Tripp has said, he's had to put off his ordination because he's gone too fast. At this time in that synod, you had to be 24 to be ordained, and he has PhD in hand, and he has just simply gone too fast. And so finally by 31, the summer of 31, he's old enough to be ordained. And he goes to his ordination supervisor and says, well, I'm ready to be ordained, but could I have a little time? I've just been invited to give lectures at the university. Could you give me a few more months? And his person overseeing his ordination was a man by the name of Max Dissel. And Max was very cunning, very loving, good mentor, but very cunning. And he said, well, Dietrich, I don't know. We've put this off for 2 years. You've been to Barcelona, you've been to New York City, all kind of waiting out the clock for you to be ordained. I don't know if we can do this. But I tell you what, if you will go with me to Cambridge, England, there's a conference for the ecumenical movement. If you will go, then I think I can push this off for a few months. So he goes, and we don't know what happens there, but Dietrich goes as a guest and leaves as the secretary to youth in the ecumenical movement. He then writes a new catechism with a friend named Hildebrandt, who will become very important to him. They will be the kind of young pastors in the group pushing the Pastors Emergency League to take action within this. But eventually he gets a call from the synod that says we have a problem. Across Berlin, Dietrich lives in the west side of Berlin, kind of over in the Grunwald area, and a very leafy professors area, the kind of head of the Weimar Republic. You know, if you think of the Weimar Republic after the war, this very kind of cultured republic that comes. It's kind of this republic of artists and reflective people. They're really the hub of that place is the very neighborhood that Dietrich is living in. But he gets a call that says we have a confirmation class in Wedding, which is a district in Berlin on the east side. And it's a very communist district, a place where there is many challenges economically, especially in this period as we are in a time of now hyperinflation, which it's hard for us to imagine the utter hyperinflation that was going on. There's stories in Richard Evans' 3-volume book about the rise of the Third Reich, who would say you could go to a cafe and a cup of coffee could cost you 800 Deutschmarks. And if you stood there, if you were there too long, if you were there 2 hours and you went to pay, it could be 10,000. That the hyperinflation was just going at an incredible rate. And there was a lot of poverty in this area. And the National Socialists were known that when they went into an area, what the SA particularly would do would go to the communist area. And what they would do is start street fights. They would beat you up. And they would use the chaos of the street fights to then also pitch to the public that they could bring law and order. I mean, they were the ones who started the fights, but they could also stop the fights. So you should follow them. And of course, there's a lot of fear after the Great War in what happened in 1917 in Russia with the Bolshevik takeover. There was a major fear that the communists could take power. And the old money in Berlin, they wanted anything but that. So all these deals started to be made with the right, and particularly then the far right, because they just didn't want the communists to come to power. Well, Dietrich gets asked to take over a confirmation class in this communist area, in the Wedding area. And he goes in, and the story goes, there's a great book called I Knew Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And it's about 20 people who write little pieces about their times knowing Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And we have 2 pieces in there from kids who were in this confirmation class. And they say they went to the confirmation class, all boys, in this wedding district, many of them with black eyes, having been beaten up by SA stormtroopers. And they come in, and it is an old pastor near retirement named Mueller, who hasn't been able to control the class. They've been out of control. So this is at the Zion Church in Wedding. So he takes them into the education building, and the boys are all upstairs with a railing looking down. And as old Pastor Mueller and Mahler, old Pastor Mahler and Dietrich walk in, the boys start throwing banana peels and paper down on them. They get up to the top level, and the old pastor kind of wrangles them into the room. And then he says, as they're all yelling and loud, he says, "Your new teacher is Herr Dr. Bonhoeffer," and then he leaves. He's like, "I'm out. I'm done. It's all over for me." And all the boys start chanting, "Bon, bon, 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 bon." And Mahler's out of there. I mean, he's thinking they could kill him now, but it's not my responsibility anymore. I'm done with this. And so the story goes that Dietrich just listened to them chant, "Bon, bon, bon, bon." And then at about this volume, he started telling them a story. He started telling a story about Harlem, about his experience in Harlem. And just the boys in the front could hear it. And then they were quiet to hear the story. And then, kind of like a cascading wave, it went back, and they were quiet. They heard the story. And he said, "If you come back next week and will be quiet enough for me, I'll tell you another story." And it transformed his confirmation class, telling them these stories. He writes a letter to his friend Erwin Schutz, who he met in New York City. He said, "For the first time ever in my ministry, I've had behavioral problems." But he said, what I just do is I come to the boys and I don't really even prepare. I mean, he does say, I'm Dietrich Bonhoeffer, so like I know stuff. He said, I don't really prepare. I just tell the boys stories, and then I tell them the biblical story, and I lace them together. And then he says, also, I tell them apocalyptic stories. The boys seem to really like apocalyptic stories. Some things are universal, I think, here. And then he says, I think humorously, a little dark comedy here. He says, I think now my behavioral problems have been taken over, and maybe I will avoid the fate of my predecessor, who the boys quite literally, he says, aggravated their teacher to death. And it is true. Poor Pastor Mahler, about 2 weeks after giving the class up, had a heart attack and died. So you think your confirmation class is bad? You're still breathing. I mean, there's been worse ones. And I do think that's really funny. It's been long enough, people. You can laugh at that. It's been a good almost 100 years here. So this is Dietrich Bonhoeffer at home, and it really changes him. And he does see Berlin in a different way, and he sees the challenges before Berlin in a different way. And he ends up moving into Wedding. It's part of the synod's process and confirmation that each boy has to have, each confirmand has to have a home visit. So Dietrich moves in and lives in this area, and spends time with the boys, and goes to each of the boys' house. And it's a very different experience for this very rich, upwardly mobile young man to now be sitting with these folks. And he realizes what's going on with National Socialism, what this means for his boys, and he sees poverty in a different way. And it really takes him to see otherness, I think, in a unique way.
Yeah. So when we turn to going to the tables and thinking about at home, when we think about family and all the vignettes around family and just how many elements you can see shaping Bonhoeffer and his own story, and then thinking about the city he returns to, but he doesn't even know half of it till he's forced there. He doesn't know what the working class experience is. He doesn't get to know all these other elements until certain others are put on his agenda, beyond his own, right? When you're helping kind of take a story of someone like Bonhoeffer and the way he encountered the other, transformed his vision of the gospel, and then think about our own in our family and in our hometown, in our own nation, in our own places, are there particular themes or questions you'd raise up, right? Because when you tell particular stories about yourself or particular stories about someone else, we immediately think of the particulars that are our own. So I sit here with 7 stories I might tell around the table right now. How would you discern which one I should be telling?
Well, the funniest one, or
Oh,
yeah, or the one that the most emotional one, which in some ways is very on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I think is this isn't an overly emotional person. This is a person who is not swayed by emotion, but nevertheless is very, very intent on living with people and seeing people for who they are. I really do think one of the things we often miss in scholarship on Bonhoeffer is how much he only knows himself through his family, and how his family becomes. I mean, some of you know this, that this is a kid a young man who writes a dissertation on the church who never went to church. I mean, that was part of the family dynamic here, is that they of course were part of a church, the Grenvald Church. They were part of it. Dietrich was confirmed in that church and things, but he really never went to church. And his family really was his experience of what it meant to be in community, what that was like. So I think a big question for us is how our families have either helped us or hindered us in I mean, maybe prepared us or kind of malformed us in certain ways for community, and how much of our own senses of who we are is embedded in that kind of primary community, because that was really important for Dietrich.
All right. Good luck sharing that one to your new neighbor.
Wait, you made me do the question?
Yeah, that's what you just did.
All right.
Now y'all have to share with each other the dignities and disasters your family gave you when encountering the gospel.
So here, we've got a couple questions for you out of the block.
Okay.
If someone was to just start reading about Bonhoeffer, where would they start? What are a couple of places you would suggest?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 different routes to go. Like, if you're thinking, where do you start in a biography of like getting just the kind of lay of the land of his life? I think probably it's hard because the most respected biography is the first one, and it's from Eberhard Bethge, but it's 1,000 pages. I mean, it's a big biography, but it is, for good or for ill, it's like the kind of earth source, if you will.
Okay.
Like that's, and there's other kind of critical scholarship thinking like, how much of the Bonhoeffer do we know is really through Eberhard Bethge? You know what I mean? Like that people are starting to ask that question, but it still is like the place to go. But it's very, very big. I think probably the best mid-sized biography is Marsh's biography, Strange Glory, is a good one to start. But if you wanted just like 150-page one, I'm kind of partial to this. It's a little bit of an older one, but it comes from the German context, obviously translated in English now. But Renata Wind wrote a biography called The Spoke and the Wheel that it's like 180 pages or something like that. But it's a really nice piece. So that's where I would start biography wise. When it comes to Bonhoeffer's own stuff, I would start with Discipleship, or The Cost of Discipleship. Or of course, a lot of people start at Life Together, and I think that's great too. But I think Discipleship gives you even a little bit more sense of his. I mean, you have to read that in context too, because it's being written as he's feeling like the confessing church is failing to stand up. So there's a real edge to it of him, really yelling at his reader to hold tight here in this moment. So he's not thinking of you reading it, he's thinking of other pastors who are going to tumble into, disobedience here, or not be able to stand up against the hurricane of what's happening in Germany in the late 1930s.
Also, really quick one, the author of the Family Systems one.
I don't know it off the top of my head, to be honest.
What's the name of it?
I don't know that either. I just know it exists. I know it on my shelf. It's a blue book with a gray kind of thing.
Blue
but
and gray.
I can, if someone really, really needs to know, just email me and I will give you the reference.
We'll find it.
We'll find it.
We'll put it on the sheet.
Yeah.
We'll follow that.
It's very bad form to reference a book
It's
and
okay.
not even know the title. I know the color of the cover.
I totally get that.
That's
And I know
terrible.
where it's on my book.
Yeah, I know exactly where it is on my bookshelf. So
Okay, we Tripp left
Oh,
this one for
gosh.
you.
yeah.
You might know this.
He told me he left me a terribly difficult question,
No.
is what I should
Do
say.
you think Bonhoeffer would engage youth ministry. How do you think they would engage youth ministry today, especially with fewer and fewer families physically showing up?
Yeah.
In other words, he seems to have a proponent for presence in physical
Right.
space. And so I wonder how he would engage in the new moves to the online ministry and some of those shifts that are taking place.
Yeah, so this is always the danger of answering anything for Bonhoeffer is really just a cipher for me to answer for myself. I think that is the problem, is we can make Bonhoeffer say anything we want him to, and we think he's us, so he's all our friends. So he always agrees with what we say. So I want to be careful with that. And I thought that question was going to be, what do we do with our property? And are we supposed to sell it all?
That was the next one.
Yeah, that one is the one that really scares me. The youth ministry one, maybe I have a little bit more to say on that is, well, I think what's fascinating, the way I understand the question is like two-pronged here. One, what would just Bonhoeffer be about in the context of youth ministry today? And he would be making a really strong push for us to not get too caught in a kind of cohort-based form of ministry. Like the youth group, or the confirmation class, things like that. The Sunday school class, he was still all about, but he was really concerned that even those separate spaces lead to an imagination that takes young people away from the center of the church community. So one of the more prophetic things that he said that I think radiates to our time is where he says that a faithful church that's ministering to young people will deny the generation gap, that they will not live in a generation gap, that they will see their children as not kind of, and we've been talking about other in a really good way here, like what does it mean to encounter the other, but there's also a sense of like othering in a way of you're strange, you're alien, we can't relate to you. And he's worried that if we draw too bold of a line between the generation gap, that we'll never return to a place where young people are at the center of our lives. And what by that he means their person, like their stories, their gifts, our life together won't go to that direction. So I think in some ways the move away from these large youth groups and youth ministry equaling youth group, as that's dissipated for a number of reasons, I think it becomes more, youth ministry potentially can be shaped more like Bonhoeffer wanted it to be. There's a possibility within this. So I think there's something significant in that. And we do have to just face the fact that as American Protestants, youth ministry has existed because of the presumption of a generation gap,
Well, and the whole generational realities today are not his.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. The only thing that makes it somewhat relevant and I think really interesting is that Bonhoeffer was doing ministry after a German youth movement. And so just after that, and we still are, our culture is still really impacted by our own youth movement that happened in the late 60s. So there was a German youth movement that happened right at the beginning of the 20th century that freaked people out. It was very different than ours. Ours was kind of a revolutionary March on Washington, grow your hair long, resist all forms of conformity. And the German one was a kind of medieval return to the artist. And I don't know if people saw like the 1970s, I want to buy, buy the world of Coke, where that actually is playing off of the Wandervogel, which was this German youth movement where it freaked parents out as kids went hiking and swimming in ponds, and they're like, they're not doing their homework, they're hiking. And so everyone had young people on their mind, was worried about it. So for him to be against the generation gap is to say all of these anxieties that there's something wrong with our kids, there's some way we have to fix them, as opposed to what it means to care for them, walk with them, hear their stories. There's something similar, but quite different too.
Okay, one last question before we let you go. Can you speak more to Bonhoeffer and the role of minister? His ministry experience stand out in ways that are missing from many famous theologians.
Yeah, I do think, this is my kind of hobby horse, if you will, but I just feel like this is a failure of Bonhoeffer scholarship. So, you can just see me as grumpy old man right now. Get off my lawn. Here's my contribution. Listen to me. You could take this answer that way, but I do think you have to see Bonhoeffer primarily as a pastor.
Yeah.
not as an ethicist, not as a systematic theologian, but primarily, I mean, he never had
Right.
academic post. You know, he
Right.
was,
Even though he was the smartest guy in the room,
he
always.
was always the smartest guy in the room. You all know someone like that. He never had an official faculty position. So I mean, he wouldn't have called it this, but he was an adjunct.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
and he wrote academic-y books, but he also primarily saw himself, I think, as a pastor. And you know, my hobby horse is that he was mainly a pastor to younger generations of people.
Yeah.
And so I think what's really important in getting back to that is to be really aware when you read Bonhoeffer, both his biography and his own writing, of how persons play within this. Like, who are the people that are important? And I feel like too often we read Bonhoeffer as an individual and then therefore make him heroic, and he wouldn't be comfortable with that. He is someone who's bound to others and others are bound to him, and it's inside those relationships that he takes responsibility. It's inside those relationships he encounters Jesus Christ. So it's really, and I think that's one of the reasons, I think intuitively, tacitly, that's one of the reasons people stay interested in Bonhoeffer, because the story is there. But I think too often we think like the story is a Tom Hanks World War II story, that's why it's cool, you know, which it partly is.
Maybe.
But really what I think makes the story move is this is a person, for all his foibles and all of his shortcomings, who is bound to other people.
Well, the twin thing.
Yeah.
That's right on.
Yeah.
I mean, the family system, yes.
But the
The
twin
death,
thing.
you know,
Yeah.
the parents.
Yeah.
But the twin thing.
The twin thing's huge.
Totally.
And we, you know, this is a little pitch for Luther Seminary here, but we do a class where we do the Bonhoeffer class in Berlin, and we've had the privilege of going to the library, which they have all of his stuff.
And do you know, Andy, the link, the QR code at the end, they get to have it for free.
Oh yeah, so there's a recorded version of that. But we get to go to the library. You won't in this, but there's boxes that they have 90 boxes of his original stuff, and a few of them are just boxes from his sister. And like old letters from them, old letters after Dietrich died that are in English because she was in London. All these pictures that I had never seen before of her brother. So I mean, there's no other sibling box. It's his twin sister's box of all this stuff. So I mean, there was a real connection there, and he wouldn't be able to even understand himself outside of his relationship with Sabine and his parents, and of course Eberhard and others.
I've got nieces. I get it.
Yeah,
twins.
Absolutely.
Like, you know.
Yeah, and nieces and nephews were incredibly important to him.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. You got to go back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you get questions online about trying to fix everyone's families?
Yeah,
you did,
and we did it.
Okay,
we did.
I mean, when you can do it that simply.
Yeah.
So in this last vignette, we're going to talk about Bonhoeffer and the underside, and I'm gonna try to set it up. We're going to unpack in conversation Bonhoeffer's kind of Christological hermeneutic, and then we're going to open it up for y'all to have a very extended table time. And the goal when we send you off is to have a conversation about the different stories of your own lives that you've been sharing Bonhoeffer's, and think about, well, our theme, Bonhoeffer, the gospel, and the other. And so the place I want us to imagine for this last vignette is Bonhoeffer. He's sitting at a beautiful Benedictine monastery. He escaped Germany again and will get pulled back to Berlin after just a few months. And he's sitting there in a Benedictine monastery. He's loving the liturgical rhythm and the hospitality. I mean, also the Alps. It's hard not to, have a quality writing break if the Alps are out your window. And he's there where he's beginning. This is early on in his writing process of what came to be Ethics, an essay after 10 years, which is in Letters and Papers traditionally. And he's there and he's trying to figure out just what do you do to locate yourself in a time where your history and your story and the horizon of the good, the true, and the beautiful is diminishing right before you. Where do you plant your feet when you don't know where to go? And so he writes this letter that he's composing from there in this beautiful place to his friends, his brother-in-law, who's part of the conspiracy, is one of the people that gets it. And he asks, have there ever been people in history who in their time like us, had so little ground under their feet. People to whom every possible alternative open to them at time appeared equally unbearable, senseless, and contrary to life. Now, as someone that receives 200 to 300 emails from clergy each month, I have read that line and they didn't know they were quoting Bonhoeffer. Because they feel that there's intersections of pressures in the world we're facing, where there are political, social, economic, cultural, militarism, all these things are going on, and the energy of them is showing up in your congregations and you don't know what to do with it, and you're supposed to be carrying the gospel of one executed on an empire's cross into the heartbeat of a people serving him, and yet they pay taxes and bow before a different nation. And you're like, WTF, what do I do? Where do we plant our feet? I mean, he's asking this, and he paints this picture of seeing the world from the underside. And recently I was doing an interview for a larger Bonhoeffer project that had come out in this fall. It's an audio documentary that tells his life story in the rise of Nazi Germany. And Victoria Barnett, a brilliant Bonhoeffer scholar and scholar of the Holocaust, said that they've recently come to understand that at this monastery, the place he went to retreat to think about how to be Christ in a world where the conflict is too high to make sense, had over 30 Polish forced laborers there. What does it feel like to ask yourself about the gospel when you have no place under your feet and a Benedictine monastery in another country? You still can't escape the way your national identity is connected to a complicity that you can't shake and you don't know what to do. And so in this letter to his friends, he reflects on the problem. And he says, the huge masquerade of evil has thrown all ethical concepts into confusion. Evil should appear in the form of light, good deeds, historical necessity. Social justice is just bewildering. It is the abysmal wickedness of evil. To be in a world where you're stewarding the God of justice and love, and all the categories, language, and frameworks to talk about it have already been occupied by an ideology that's evil, and so language doesn't work. Where do you go? And then he says, are we still of any use? A lot of us think it, not all of us have the courage to ask it. Are we still of any use? This honest question he asked, rather profound. We have been silent witnesses to evil deeds. We have become cunning and learned at the arts of obfuscation and equivocal speech. Unbearable conflicts have worn us down or even made us cynical. That kind of clarity and honesty, I think, is something it's hard. It is very hard to manage because obfuscation, masquerading, occupying language of the good that's in public, but never bringing it to the material reality of the cross of Christ is so easy to do. But when we don't bring it to the cross, we remain complicit in the things that keep us up tonight, and we don't know where to plant our feet, and we wonder whether we're of any use. And it's there he invites his kind of one place he takes a step forward into this, and it is Christological. Not surprising for Bonhoeffer, but it's challenging today. And he says that I believe that God can and will let good come out of everything, even the greatest evil. But God is no timeless fate, but waits for and responds to sincere prayer and responsible action. It remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcast, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled, in short, from the perspective of suffering. Bonhoeffer mentions at this monastery receiving some of the first letters from his students who were being trained in the seminary and then were brought into the military and forced to serve. And they're telling him reports from the Eastern Front, where he's getting to know the tragedy and evil that's being done by their nation. And there he is seeing the effort, the fruits of it, with Polish forced laborers serving at a Benedictine monastery. And so where can he venture the idea of faithfulness, but say, what have we gained in Christ, as we know where to start? The God has revealed God's self on the cross. And if we want to know where God is, we go there and learn to look from that perspective. Just imagine how far that is from an upper middle class, overeducated German who had to get over just the prejudice of meeting his Roman Catholic friends, then thinking that there's nothing he could learn from American theologians, and then going, actually, I learned how to preach the gospel and decided to become a Christian because I founded an Abyssinian Baptist church from the black church. And then he goes home, and across town in the working class neighborhood, he had to learn how to tell the story of the gospel, to encounter people's story in his own town he didn't know, right? Like over and over in his life, the gospel had to catch up with all those that bear its image. And when he didn't know what the future looks like and how do you find God in the presence of history, he offers us a hermeneutic, a way of reading and interpreting the times. And it's to stand at the foot of the cross and look from there. Not to stand before a flag, not to stand in the neighborhood that tithes, supports us. You could think of all these places, not to stand in the academic space, but to stand with the least of these. And so I'm interested in how you're seeing this, Andy, because that Christological hermeneutic is something that in some sense gave him the energy to continue to expand through his life. But it's also what he finds at the end and invites us to when we ask these kinds of questions of where to put our feet and how to orient ourselves at a time where we don't know if we're of any use.
Yeah, and I think one of the profound things about the letter after 10 years, and really that's both the beginning and the end of Bonhoeffer's theology, which is so Christocentric, is that it is leaning in to the doctrine, into Christology. But I think for Bonhoeffer, one of the reasons that he has so much resonance with us is it's never just bound in the idea. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, he says, whatever you want to call cheap grace, he has a lot of things that he calls cheap grace. Cheap grace is grace as a doctrine, which is fascinating. Cheap grace is a principle. Cheap grace is grace as a program. Cheap grace is ultimately, at the end, grace as an idea. And I think he's deeply, deeply concerned with how Christianity can become an idea. And then it can become an ideology atop other ideologies. And then we fight over which idea is the best. And to put words into Bonhoeffer's mouth, I don't think he thinks the world needs another idea, or that the world needs Christianity as an idea. He doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe that idea could save. But he does think that the person of Jesus Christ can. So everything is seen through person structure for him, because the person of Jesus Christ lives and moves and encounters persons. So you can't take away that this is written to three persons, that it's written to Hans von Dahani, it's written to Eberhard Bethke, it's written to General Oster, these people who have put themselves in the breach for other persons, and therefore in some ways embody Jesus Christ. But he will not allow us to get abstract and to allow our Christology or any of our theology to ever be disconnected from persons. And so at the core, there's this like almost mystical category for Bonhoeffer. It's probably not fair to call it mystical, but I would call it mystical, where he uses this German word called Stillvertretung, which is really hard to translate, where he really thinks the place we encounter Jesus Christ is when we really share the place of another, when we bear their sufferings, when we see them from below. But in that, that's not just a mutual pat on the back. He thinks something mystical and transformational happens, that as we share one another's suffering, that Jesus Christ becomes present and is working life out of death, bringing out of those experiences of death, bringing life out of it. But it becomes when persons share deeply that there's a profound change that happens. And I think Bonhoeffer really believes Jesus Christ is the person who is the fullness of God who shares. The very natures of the divine and the human share in his person. And the way that the Christian participates in the life of Jesus Christ is by sharing in the life of persons in the world. And he'd be very uncomfortable even with our discourses today where we get stuck in ideologies, because ideologies will always totalize others, and that we have to see others as persons who have other relationships that make them. This is why the family piece is so important for him, because he thinks it's an abstraction to not see you bound and suffering and joyful with these other relationships that make you, that you have your being in these relationships. And Jesus Christ will meet you in those relationships and join your person with his person and bring you new life out of all your experiences of death. So he's really calling us to see these boys in wedding, to see these Polish forced laborers as persons. And therefore, if they are persons, then the person of Jesus Christ is there. And that there is a call of responsibility, not to uphold ideologies, not even to do what's right, but to do the will of God. The ethics starts not with, he says, ethics is not the question, what is right or wrong? It is the question, what is the will of God? And if you want to discern the will of God, you will always find the will of God made known in Jesus Christ, working for life out of death, bringing life to persons, upholding and caring for persons.
Mm-hmm. So one example from that letter that I didn't even put in here, but it makes perfect sense, I think, with what you just shared, is his reflection on the temptation to have contempt for humanity. And you raise that question, like, when an ideology, any of them, become the lens by which you interrogate the other, then it's ultimately idolatrous. Because the lens for the Christian is that the horizon that meets the other is the horizon of Christ. And, and he gives that, like, the kind of Christ mediating all relations with all creation imagery. And it wasn't until talking to Victoria and hearing that this is being written while those Polish forced laborers are there, and he's on retreat and like this liturgical communities around, that this question of contempt comes up. Because it's so tempting for us to inscribe ourselves as the hero in a narrative, right? And so whoever is your ideological other, now that you have obviously the most beautiful, zesty, true experience and reality of the gospel, let me articulate it. And look at the dum-dums. And how he wrestles with that, knowing the people he's having contempt for are the ones who are forcing these Polish laborers to serve him there, that are building death camps. That, knowing that, right, getting these letters from his students, he says this he talks about the danger of allowing ourselves to be driven to contempt for humanity is very real. And it's not that he's denying the reality and ugliness. It's that does not get to the full heart of reality where Christ mediates. And so he says, through contempt for humanity, we fall victim precisely to our opponent's own chief errors. Whoever despises another human being will never be able to make anything of him. Nothing of what we despise in another is itself foreign to us. So you went to a retreat in another country at a monastery, forced laborers are there. Just imagine how easy it is for Americans to tell a story where we're the good guys in our own story. But what happens if we see the way we're embedded in structures, institutions, and places where we might be on retreat and being seized by the gospel in a beautiful rhythm, but also we're being served by forced laborers? And so then he says, we must learn to regard human beings less in what they do or neglect to do, and more in terms of what they suffer. The only fruitful relation to human beings, particularly to the weak among us, is love. That is, the will to enter into and keep community with them, and not hold human beings in contempt, but become human for their sake. And 2 years ago, Jeff Pugh and I did an online class using Bonhoeffer with like 4,000 people. Reading this passage, the number of ministers that said, I had to repent because I hold people that voted for Donald Trump with contempt.
Mm.
And Bonhoeffer insists that you're missing something.
Mhm.
And then you think back to all the contempt he had in his life for Roman Catholics, and then he goes there for Holy Week, for Americans. And then like you go through all these encounters with the other. And I think that invitation to the cross, when it goes for those who are suffering and oppressed, the cross gives us a hermeneutic for seeing liberation. But when it goes to looking at not the victims, but the violators, it asks us to join the God who, while we were yet sinners, died for us. Who and that double action of victim and violator only is possible through a Christological hermeneutics. Anyway, I get excited about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and the only other thing that I would add that I think is really central in how he works this out is that, and this goes all the way back to Act and Being. So, early 1930s, the habilitation, is that at the very end of that very hard book, he has a section, and people who know the backstory of this, he's in Barcelona, he's revamping a Sunday school, and he writes back that he knows what he wants to write, his second dissertation. So in the German system, even today, you have to write a second dissertation. First one qualifies you as a doctor. Second one qualifies you to be a professor. I mean, it doesn't mean you'll be a professor, but it qualifies you for it. So it's called a habilitation. And so he decides he wants to write this. He writes back to his advisor, a guy by the name of Reinhold Seeberg, and says, I know my topic. I want to write on the consciousness of children. That's what I want to write on. And Seeberg writes him back and says, absolutely not. It's an inappropriate topic. You need a more philosophical topic. So he writes a book called Act and Being, which is both an affirmation and a critique of Karl Barth's act theology and Martin Heidegger's philosophy of being. It's very, very dense, very, very complicated. But at the very end of it, the last 3 pages is a section called The Child as Eschatological, because no one puts Dietrich in a corner. You don't tell Dietrich he can't do something. That's not how his mother raised him. He is going to think for himself. So he does. He adds this section in. But one of the most beautiful things he says is that the form one has to take to enter the kingdom of God is you must be a child. You can only enter as a child. This is the eschatological form. Now, the good news is that's an invitation for all of us because we've all been children. So only children are allowed. But it also means there's an ethical component here that you are called to see your neighbor as first and foremost as a child, bound to other people as a person who care about them. You may hate their guts, but they are still a child bound in relationships with others who are very dear to them and important to them, and to see them as those who suffer those relationships in joy and in deep pain, that they suffer being children, and that we must see each other as children because Jesus Christ, he says in a lecture from Barcelona, Jesus Christ is the inventor of childhood. It's not psychology that invents the category of childhood. It's Jesus Christ in the Matthean text who takes the child to him and says, if you want to enter the kingdom. And I think that has a lot to do with how Bonhoeffer sees personhood. Children are fundamentally persons. They are bound in act and in being. They have their humanity in the freedom of their own act, but they always are connected to communities in being. And to see a child, you always have to see a child as both act and being. And he wants to remind us as Christians, we ourselves are act and being. That Jesus Christ acts for us, and in acting for us gives us being, connects us to a community. That humanity has to be seen as those with the freedom to act, but always bound to others in love and advocacy, ultimately in Stellvertretung, which means to share their place, to be with and for them.
So as you turn to your tables for our kind of last conversation time, the invitation is to share the humanity of the other that's hardest for you to inscribe in God's story. Thinking of Bonhoeffer's experience in that monastery, he's learning to tell a story where he's not sure he's in it, right? He doesn't know where to put his feet and if he's in any worth. He doesn't know if these individuals who are so compelled by something he finds utterly evil and vile are in it. And then he's seeing the forced Polish laborers, and knows that they're the ones closest to where Christ is found, and they're in it. And so part of the conversation and part of wrestling with Bonhoeffer's invitation to expand the gospel is to name the places where you hesitate to recognize the dignity that even enemies get. So, good luck.
So these are left over from the 2 sessions, so
Oh,
you
okay.
pick who you want to answer, okay? We know of Bonhoeffer's connection with and leadership of one of the confessing church seminaries, but how did the seminaries and the students interact with the confessing church? And how did those confessing churches identify with or connect or disconnect with the evangelical churches aligned with the National Socialist? Okay, so there's some questions about how they fit in the ecclesiology. And then finally, how many confessing churches were there? Or do we have any idea what the percentage of them that there were?
Oh, okay. So the Victoria Barnett's big book on the history of the confessing church is one I'd go look at.
Okay.
And in the next few weeks, at some point, a long interview with her come out on the podcast. So you should just listen to that. But the thing I would say, and you can add on to this, is the confessing church is not, its story is much more complicated than the kind of heroic version we tell. In the same way, Bonhoeffer's unfinished hero, and not like this, like he's growing and understanding complexity and frail and broken in places. So it wasn't that simple. And the big theme in the long history of the confessing church, as to when it kind of became increasingly impotent, is the way in which, as the culture at large in Germany became more and more shaped by Nazi energy, then what functioned as those that wanted to be moderate and not engaged in even confessing churches moved towards that more authoritarian style. And so Victoria Barnett, in her book Bystanders, which is looking at this history, and there's a cool section in it at the Holocaust Museum if people want to next time they go, is to be a bystander is a verb, not a noun. And so the challenge in a church was that you can't just have a label or an identity or a confession or the Barman Declaration or something like that and go, okay, well, this is what we assert, now we're going to do it. That when the domination or the ideology that's dominating your culture is growing, then you have to opt out of that energy. To be a bystander is to let the dominating framework reign. And the difficulty for so many of the churches that wanted to take a stand early on, like the Fuller principle or the Arian paragraph and these kind of things, is that as the cultural and social consequences got bigger for resisting, they got quieter. And that to me reminds me of being clergy after 9/11. If you grew up Anabaptist and after 9/11, and all of a sudden you thought you were in a peace church, and they're like, well, let's bomb Iraq because that has something to do with Saudi Arabians who were trained in Afghanistan. There's that energy, right? And you're getting pulled.
Yeah, I think that's the place to go and look. I mean, I find the history really complicated to figure out how it went, and I do think it's really fascinating that for the most part, I mean, Bonhoeffer was pretty central in that. I mean, to be one of the 5, there are 5 illegal seminaries, and, for the most part illegal. They do become illegal. I mean, the Gestapo shuts down Finkenwalde in 1937. But until then, they can pretty much operate. I mean, when you're the Nazis and you're thinking about world domination, you're not really worried about 5 little seminaries. You know what I mean? You're like,
they're working with the coinade,
right? It isn't until what's fascinating is that the group does a class trip to Sweden to celebrate Dietrich's 30th birthday, and when they go, they get to Stockholm. The bishop comes out, the Swedish bishop comes out and welcomes all these illegal Like he gives him official, I think he's even robed. And I'm not positive by that, but there is you can see in the Bonhoeffer books, there's a picture that became front page news in the Stockholm paper. And then that got
So
back.
it wasn't quiet.
That got back to the Gestapo. And then they were like, okay, this is embarrassing. We're going to close this stuff down. And they didn't like that it existed either. But I always think like Dietrich wasn't Niemöller. Like Niemöller was running this thing and was arrested and did, 6 years in jail or something like that in a concentration camp for really being the head of the confessing church. And it really was an uneven reality. And it fit a lot of the larger public. Like some people felt like, and this was more true for the Pastors Emergency League than the confessing church, but some pastors were just like, we've been humiliated by World War I. We've dealt with just unbelievable inflation. We were, the thing that people forget is all through World War I, the German public had been told that they're winning. And then at the last minute, and then when soldiers came back, their generals told them no other army beat you. Like, in other words, you lost this war, but no one really beat you. So the whole German population, and then Versailles happens, just felt like they were getting screwed. And actually, both the British and the French, there were groups within those governments that thought, we are being pretty harsh here. Like, this is, we cannot continue to make them pay back all these reparations and things like that. And so you can imagine, this isn't to excusing it, but some people are feeling like, oh, well, we need a strong hand running the government. I don't like the National Socialists reaching into the church, but, we do need to get our national confidence back. And, so and that's not to excuse it. It's just to say it's very complicated. And that reality was at the beginning and even went into the confessing church and made it always quite fragile and problematic and not able to stand up to the fierce winds that were coming in the late 1930s, especially as war mounted. So it's a tragic tale, I think.
Okay, here you may have answered some of this because this came before you made a statement towards the end of the last one, Andy. But does Bonhoeffer's Christian ethos mean without the crucifixion, can there be no resurrection in every age of crisis experiencing hopelessness? That whole ethics of the ethos of the cross and the crucifixion connected with hope and right.
Yeah, I'll start and then you can pick it up. But I think if you're answering for Bonhoeffer, that there is such an all-encompassing Christological hermeneutic for him that he is really seeing everything through cross and resurrection. I think that's been one of the critiques of Bonhoeffer after is that it's a very kind of Lutheran read. It's a very, you start with the second article. But what's important for Bonhoeffer in that, and I'll let Tripp you answer. But what's important for him is that the core problem for Bonhoeffer, I think, theologically, is how do we, it's not, I mean, all the other ethical stuff is there. This is, I get annoyed with Bonhoeffer scholars on this. I think the most concrete, the real center of Bonhoeffer's concern is the concreteness of revelation. How does Jesus Christ concretely encounter us today? So and
it's personhood.
There's a sense of personhood. That is what's so concrete for him. That he's trying to pick up the Bardian revolution with the Kantian problem, and that I mean, as a German, he's trying to solve that. You know, those realities are there. So community, the church as Gemeinde, as community, becomes the place for the concreteness of revelation. And he thinks he needs the second article of the creed to do that. He needs Jesus Christ, who is concrete, is the concreteness of revelation. He has to work it through that. And so for Bonhoeffer, I don't think theologically you have to work it Christologically, but I think for Bonhoeffer you do. And some of us who are bound to Bonhoeffer out of love and necessity would do the same. But
part of it, right, is because of his honesty about God. And so, like in Letters and Papers, where he talks about God continually gets pushed out of the world. And, some of that is like, oh, science is explaining something. So, like, where do you put God? But also, the state runs and doesn't need a state church managing it anymore. In fact, the state church is a bunch of Nazis. The economy orients our labor and things. Like, why do we need this? Like, what, you got this obsession with vocation. Really, there's a sense in which God used to be the big other that legitimated the organizing structures of economics, culture, society, and that has been pushed out all the way on the cross. And he doesn't go, oh, we need a return to a Christian Germany in some like triumphal sense, even though he really loves being a German Christian.
I think so.
And there's a few uncomfortable passages in ethics, but then he goes like, yeah, all the way pushed out, God's been pushed all the way out on the cross. So in what context does the revelation of God find purchase? It's in the cross of Christ. It's when God isn't an abstract or legitimating concept, but a material one all the way on the cross. And then where does that happen in the present? It's when God shows up in the materiality in relations, right? And there's this bit in his Christ the Sinner that, well, this is Tripp's version of it, so I don't know exactly how accurate it is, but he said Christ only promised to be three places: in communion, like when you tell the story while you're eating, when two or three are gathered, like with friendships that are risky, honest, and vulnerable, and when you serve the least of these. And too many people think you talk about God by explaining the ontological structure of existence, explaining the big, great chain of being, or arguing philosophers to legitimate the reality of God. And he goes, oh, figure that out if you want. But let me tell you where God promised to be: in Christ, at the table, in relations, and in service to the other. And you work out from there. And those are material realities.
All right, go serve the other on the table in the other room.
Okay.
Thank you.
This is the first time we've tried this, that the idea of a salon and the idea then of having about 120 people here in the room and over 400 people in the online version with my colleague in the dean's office, Terry Elton, is in the other room. And then when Andy and Tripp would go out during the conversation so that then they would answer questions for them, and a different experience here. So thank you all for joining online. We're going to be sending out, you'll receive a follow-up that tells you some ways that we are 90% donor supported, and it'd be an invitation if you'd care to make a donation of anything, or if you're interested in signing up for our Faith+Lead courses or membership subscription. And my grandpa gave a lot of speeches for a political party that probably most of you don't belong to. And one time, at the end of the night, after this senator and that congressman and this mayor had all been allowed to be greetings, at 11 at night, the keynote speaker was brought forth. And here is his entire speech. Best wishes and good night.